Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheleft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. So let's start off this episode a little differently. I'm going to play you a few audio clips. The first one is from Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt.
And on the right, this is the most accessible and transparent administration in history.
And a second one from Karoline Leavitt.
President Trump is truly the most transparent and accessible president in American history.
Now, I promise those are actually two different times that she was speaking. Now, here is one from RFK Jr.
But it's the most transparent administration that we've ever seen, the most accessible administration in history.
And one from former DHS Secretary Tulsi Gabbard.
Thanks to President Trump's leadership and his day one executive orders, we've been focused on transparency and accountability.
And finally, from the man, President Donald Trump himself.
And just so you know, I was the most transparent and am transparent president in history. I think we've been the most transparent administration in the history of our country.
Adore, particularly in this administration. It sounds clean and reassuring, almost virtuous enough to frame and hang behind the podium. Transparent government, open government, accountable government, a government with nothing to hide. And the Trump administration did not merely promise to be more transparent than the administrations before it. It didn't promise improvement around the edges. Donald Trump and the people surrounding him have repeatedly described this as the most transparent administration in American history. And that's not a modest claim. That's not saying we'll try to do better. That's planting a flag at the very top of the mountain and announcing that nobody has ever stood higher. Fine. Let's measure it. Not according to how often the president talks to reporters, not according to how many press briefings Karoline Leavitt holds, or based on how many interviews cabinet officials give to friendly television hosts and podcasters and influencers, and not according to how many times the word transparency appears in a speech or a press release. Because talking constantly is not the same as revealing something. A magician talks constantly. That does not mean he wants you watching his hands. Real transparency is what happens when the information is uncomfortable, when soldiers have been injured, when a disease may be spreading, when food may be contaminated, when pollution data complicates the administration's narrative. When Congress asks a senior official a direct question and the truthful answer may be politically damaging. When documents have been promised, Congress has passed a law requiring their release, and the public wants to know whether everything required was actually provided. That's where the slogan meets the test. So, in this episode, we're not going to assume that every delayed report is a conspiracy. We're not going to pretend government has no legitimate secrets. And we're not going to label every incomplete answer a lie simply because we don't like the person who is giving it. We're going to do something much simpler. We're going to take the promise, define a fair standard, and examine the record. And ask whether the administration that calls itself the most transparent in American history has actually made it easier for Americans to see what their government is doing. Because Transparency is not what government calls itself. Transparency is what the rest of us are allowed to verify. Hello, neighbors. Happy Monday, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, a podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today, we're talking about transparency. Not transparency as a branding word, not transparency as a slogan polished for press releases. Actual transparency, the kind that lets the public see what government is doing, check what officials are saying, and decide whether those officials deserve to be trusted. This episode is not about one scandal. It's not about one cabinet member or one agency. It's about a promise. The Trump administration repeatedly describes itself as the most transparent administration in American history. So today we're going to do something surprisingly rare in politics. We're going to measure a promise against the evidence. We'll look at the information government agencies chose to release or delay or remove or narrow or stop collecting. We'll look at what happened when members of Congress asked senior officials direct questions. And we'll look at one of the administration's biggest transparency promises of all, the release of the Epstein files. The question isn't whether this administration communicated constantly. It did, and it does. The question is whether all that communication made the truth easier to verify. By the end of the episode, I hope you'll have enough evidence to decide for yourself whether this administration has lived up to the standard that it set. So let's begin with the most basic question. What does transparency actually mean? Before we start keeping score, we need to agree on the rules of the game. If we're going to spend the next, 45 minutes to an hour asking whether this administration has been transparent, we better know what that word actually means. And surprisingly, it's not as simple as it sounds. So let's start with what transparency isn't. Transparency does not mean that the president should hold a press conference every morning and announce where every submarine is. It doesn't mean the CIA should post its list of undercover agents on Instagram. It doesn't mean the FBI should publish the details of an active criminal investigation before it's finished. And it doesn't mean the Pentagon should live stream military operations as they're happening. Every government has secrets, and some of them are things that should remain secret. If revealing information would put troops in danger, expose intelligence resources, compromise ongoing investigations, or create an immediate national security risk, then keeping that information confidential isn't a failure of transparency. It's a responsible government. I don't think many Americans, left, right, or center, would disagree with that premise. So if that's not transparency, then what is? Transparency is giving citizens the information they legitimately need to evaluate what their government is doing. It's publishing casualty figures after they've happened in a military operation. It's telling the public when contaminated food has entered the marketplace. It's making disease surveillance data available so doctors and researchers and public health officials can respond appropriately. It's preserving environmental data so communities understand what's happening to the air they breathe and the water they drink. And it's answering direct questions from Congress when elected representatives are performing oversight on behalf of the American people. Now, notice something about every one of those examples. None of them require the government to reveal military secrets or expose intelligence sources or compromise legitimate investigations. They're simply about giving the public enough information to determine whether government is doing what it says it's doing. And that's an important distinction, because this episode is not built around the idea that the government should reveal everything. It's built around the idea that government should explain itself whenever it reasonably can. And here's where another distinction becomes important. Accessibility is not the same thing as transparency. This administration points, sometimes quite reasonably, to the fact that President Trump talks to reporters frequently. Caroline Leavitt holds regular press briefings. Cabinet officials appear on television. Administration officials sit down with podcasters. The White House posts constantly on social media, and all those things are real. All those things are also not the same thing as transparency. Think about it this way. Imagine you call your bank because you found a mysterious $1,000 charge on your credit card. A customer service representative answers immediately. They're polite. They stay on the phone for an hour. They answer every question except the one you actually called about. They tell you how much they value your business. They explain the history of the company. They describe all the wonderful fraud protections they offer. They thank you for your patience. They wish you a wonderful day. And after 60 minutes, you still have no idea where the $1,000 charge came from. Now, would you describe that experience as transparent? Of course not. It was accessible. You had access to a representative, but you never got the information that you actually needed. And government works the same way. A president can answer dozens of shouted questions while walking to Marine One and still avoid the one that matters most. Or he can insult the reporter who asked the question rather than answer it. A cabinet secretary can testify before Congress for 6 hours and never provide a direct answer to a simple yes or no question. An agency can issue press releases every single day while quietly removing data sets that researchers have relied upon for years. Communication and transparency overlap, but they are not identical. Here's the definition I want you to keep in mind throughout this episode. Accessibility means the door is open. Transparency means you can actually see what's inside. That is the standard that I'm going to use today. Not perfection, not omniscience, just a simple question. When information became politically inconvenient, did this administration make it easier for Americans to understand what was happening, or did they make it harder? Because that's when transparency stops being just a slogan. That's when it becomes a test. And the first place we're going to look is where transparency often begins: the information government chooses to give us before anyone even has to ask. So every day, thousands of federal employees gather information most of us don't ever think about. Military casualty reports, disease surveillance, food contamination investigations, air quality measurement, water pollution data, crop diseases, consumer product recalls, weather observations, and the list goes on and on. Most of us don't wake up in the morning wondering to ourselves what the CDC published overnight or whether the EPA updated a database. We simply assume those systems are there, quietly doing their jobs, collecting the information, checking it, publishing it, because that's part of the government's job. It's one of those invisible public services that you don't notice until it stops working. It sort of like the brakes on your car. You probably don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the brakes on your car until the moment you need them. Government information works in a very similar way. Most of us don't pay attention to these systems until something goes wrong. A war breaks out, a foodborne illness spreads, dangerous product reaches the store shelves, a virus begins circulating, and then suddenly information isn't just interesting, it's essential. Because information is how people make decisions. Parents decide whether to send their children to school. Doctors decide how to treat patients. Communities decide whether drinking water is safe. Military families try to understand what happened to their loved ones. the markets react and governors respond and businesses make decisions. Ordinary people change their behavior. All because government collected information and shared it. That's why transparency isn't just some philosophical idea. It's infrastructure. Just as roads help move cars, information helps move decisions. And when that infrastructure starts to crack, people don't merely lose facts, they lose confidence, and they start wondering, what else don't we know? Now, before we get into the individual stories, I do want to make something clear. This episode is not based on the idea that every missing report proves a conspiracy. Sometimes agencies make mistakes. Sometimes laboratories produce conflicting results. Sometimes websites are redesigned, or staffing shortages delay reports, or numbers change because new information comes in. Those things happen all the time under every administration. And if that's all we found today, then there wouldn't be much of an episode. What we're looking for is something different. We're asking whether the administration repeatedly made information harder to obtain or easier, whether transparency increased or decreased. So let's start with perhaps the most sobering example, military casualties. Because regardless of your politics, regardless of whether you are for or against what's going on in Iran, every American should agree on at least one thing. When American service members are killed or injured, their country deserves an accurate accounting. And it's not curiosity. It's because those men and women volunteered to place themselves in harm's way. The least a democratic government owes them and their families, I would say, is honesty about the cost. Now, that doesn't mean the Pentagon should announce casualty figures while missiles are still flying. During the active combat, information can legitimately be delayed. Commanders need to protect ongoing operations. They need to verify reports. They need to notify families before any names are made public, and all of that is reasonable. But once the immediate danger has passed, then the expectation changes. The public has a right to know what happened, and where questions began to emerge following the administration's military action against Iran is here. Initial public statements suggested a relatively limited impact on American personnel. As additional reporting emerged, however, the number of injured service members continued to grow. Some injuries had initially been classified as minor. Others became publicly known only after journalists began asking questions and lawmakers sought additional information. The Pentagon denied that it had intentionally concealed casualties. Officials argued that injuries are often identified over time, particularly things like traumatic brain injuries, which may not be immediately diagnosed. And that's a legitimate point. Medical evaluations can evolve and symptoms appear days later. No fair assessment should ignore that reality. However, critics argued that the public picture remained incomplete longer than it should have, and that information often seemed to emerge only after outside scrutiny intensified. Now, whether you ultimately agree with the Pentagon's explanation really isn't the point. The point is this: transparency isn't simply about eventually releasing information. It's also about whether information is released promptly, clearly, and in a way that inspires public confidence. Imagine your local school district announced that a bus had been involved in an accident. At first, you're told that nobody was hurt. Then later, it's revealed that several students were injured. Then later, that number increases again. Eventually, the district says, well, we weren't hiding anything. We were updating the numbers as new information came in. That explanation might be completely true, but many parents would still ask, if that's the case, why did it take repeated questioning before we got the full picture? That's how transparency works. Sometimes perception matters because perception affects trust. Now, let's move from the battlefield to something much closer to your kitchen table. Because if casualty reports affect the families of soldiers, food safety affects all of us. Food safety is one of those things that it's one of those things that's almost invisible when it's working. You don't walk into a grocery store wondering whether the lettuce has been tested, or you don't stand in the dairy aisle asking whether inspectors visited the processing plant. You assume somebody somewhere is paying attention because that's the deal. We pay taxes. The FDA monitors the food supply. When something dangerous slips through, they investigate it. If contamination is confirmed, they warn the public. That system isn't perfect. Food recalls happen every year. Outbreaks happen every year. Nobody expects the FDA to prevent every case of food poisoning. What people do expect is honesty. If there is a problem, tell us promptly, clearly, completely. And that's where concerns began surfacing this year. And one issue involved FDA warning letters. These are formal notices that agencies send after inspectors identify significant problems at food facilities. They're important because they don't just inform the company. Once they're published, they also inform everyone else. Consumers and retailers and researchers and state health departments and journalists. It's another piece of the transparency system. Earlier this year, reports emerged that more than a dozen warning letters had not been posted publicly as quickly as had been customary. The FDA disputed suggestions that it was abandoning transparency, but critics argued that delaying those letters delayed the public's ability to understand potential food safety problems. Again, notice what we're doing here. We're not saying contaminated food was deliberately hidden. We're asking a narrower question. If important information reaches the public later than normal, does that make the system more transparent or less transparent? Then came another controversy. The administration postponed implementation of the FDA's food traceability rule. Now, that may sound like the sort of sentence guaranteed to make people reach for the remote, but stay with me, because it's actually pretty simple. Imagine investigators discovered that dozens of people across 6 states became seriously ill after eating contaminated spinach. The first question isn't, how did this happen? The first question is, where did the spinach come from? And if you can answer that quickly, you can remove it from store shelves. You can notify consumers. You can prevent additional illnesses. That's what traceability is. It's the ability to follow the food backwards through the supply chain, almost like tracing a package through UPS, except instead of trying to find your birthday present, you're trying to stop people from getting sick. The rule was designed to make that process faster and more accurate. The administration delayed its implementation, arguing that businesses needed additional time to comply and that the original timeline imposed unnecessary burdens. Supporters of the delay called it practical. Critics argued it postponed an important public health safeguard. Reasonable people can debate the policy itself, but transparency enters the discussion because better traceability means better information. The faster investigators can identify where contaminated food originated, the faster the public learns what is happening. Then there was the Cyclospora outbreak. If you haven't heard much about Cyclospora, you're probably not alone. It's a parasite that causes gastrointestinal illness, often linked to contaminated fresh produce. During this year's outbreak, questions arose after the FDA initially announced that a sample had tested positive for Cyclospora before later stating the result was a false positive. The agency maintained that it corrected the record because additional testing showed that the initial finding was incorrect. Critics questioned the timing, particularly because the reversal came after meetings involving company representatives and administration officials. Now, just to be careful, there is no verified evidence that those meetings caused the FDA to change its conclusion. That is an important distinction. Suspicion is not proof. However, transparency isn't only about whether a decision was right. It's also about whether the public has enough information to understand why the decision changed. When agencies reverse conclusions, people are going to naturally ask, what new evidence emerged? Who reviewed it? Why did the agency become more confident in one conclusion than the other? They're not hostile questions. They're transparency questions. Because confidence in public institutions doesn't come from being told, trust us. It comes from showing the work. Okay, so let's shift from food to disease, because if food safety protects what goes into our bodies, public health surveillance tells us what may already be spreading among us. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention exist for many reasons. But one of the most important jobs is remarkably straightforward. Collect information, analyze it, share it. Doctors depend on it, hospitals depend on it, state health departments depend on it, researchers depend on it, and we, the public, often depend on it without even realizing it. During the opening months of the administration, public health experts raised concerns after publication of the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, commonly called the MMWR. It was temporarily interrupted. If you've never heard of it, don't worry, most Americans haven't. But within public health, it's one of the country's most respected publications. Think of it as the government's weekly medical bulletin. When unusual outbreaks occur, when new trends emerge, when doctors need reliable national information, the MMWR has traditionally been one of the first places that they look. It was beginning to interfere with the normal flow of scientific information. The administration maintained that the pause was part of a broader review process. Again, that's an explanation. Whether it fully explains the disruption is a separate question. Numerous CDC datasets and web pages, particularly those involving gender and related topics. Some of the materials later returned, others were revised, and others still remained unavailable. The administration argued that these changes reflected new executive priorities and policy directives. Critics argued that the removing public data sets, regardless of the reason, made it more difficult for researchers and public health professionals to actually do their work. And once again, the issue isn't simply politics, it's transparency. Because every data set that disappears, every report that's delayed, every surveillance system that is weakened changes what the public is able to know. And if transparency means giving citizens the information they need to understand reality, then reducing that information deserves careful scrutiny. Now, let's talk a little bit about the environment, because the same pattern appears there as well. Unlike food recalls or military casualties, environmental data often doesn't make headlines. It just quietly exists in the background. Measurements, reports, maps, emissions inventories, air quality readings, water testing, climate trends. Most people never think about them until they need them. Imagine you live downstream from a manufacturing plant, or near a chemical facility, or in a community where your childhood asthma rates have been climbing. You probably aren't reading FDA or EPA reports for fun. You're looking for answers. Is something changing? Is pollution getting worse? Is something measuring it? And if it's being measured, can I see the data? That is transparency. Because environmental information it isn't just for scientists, it's for homeowners deciding where to buy a house. It's parents wondering why their children keep developing respiratory problems, local governments trying to plan infrastructure, businesses making investment decisions, researchers identifying the trends that happen over long-term periods of time. Ordinary people who are trying to understand what's happening in their own communities. During the first months of this current administration, researchers and environmental organizations began documenting significant changes to publicly available EPA information. Climate-related web pages disappeared. Other pages were rewritten. Some references to climate change and environmental justice were removed or substantially altered. The administration defended many of these changes as part of a broad effort to reflect new policy priorities. That's their explanation. Critics, however, argue that removing or rewriting scientific information doesn't merely change the government's messaging, it changes what the public can easily access. Again, notice the distinction. We're not talking about whether climate change is real. We're not debating environmental regulations. We're talking about access to information. If a web page containing specific guidance disappears, has transparency increased? Then came another issue. The EPA missed the deadline for publishing its annual greenhouse gas inventory. Now, I know eyes glaze over when someone says greenhouse gas inventory, but here's why it matters. Every year, the federal government produces a comprehensive accounting of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. Think of it as an annual financial statement, except instead of dollars, it's carbon emissions. And again, researchers use it, state governments use it, businesses use it, other countries use it. Missing that deadline doesn't simply delay paperwork. It delays one of the country's most important environmental reference documents. The independent researchers eventually stepped in and produced their own substitute analysis because the official report wasn't available. Now, that in and of itself is extraordinary, not because independent scientists aren't capable, of course they're capable, but because it illustrates what happens when government information systems stop functioning the way they're supposed to. Other organizations attempt to fill the gap. Now, that may reduce damage, but it doesn't eliminate the question. Why was there a gap in the first place? The administration has also proposed eliminating greenhouse gas reporting requirements for dozens of categories of emission sources. The supporters of this argue this would reduce unnecessary regulatory burdens and reporting costs. And of course, critics argue it leaves the public with less information about pollution. Now, those things in and of themselves are legitimate policy disagreements. Reasonable people can disagree about regulations. But transparency is what we're talking about here. Transparency asks a different question. Regardless of whether you support more regulation or less, shouldn't the public have more information as opposed to less information? That's a different debate entirely. And I think a very important one. We've seen 4 very different stories so far. One involved military casualty reporting, one food safety, one public health, and one environmental information. And at a surface level, they don't really seem connected. Different agencies, different issues, different audiences. But if you look just one level deeper, each story asks essentially the same question. When the federal government possessed information that mattered to the public, did Americans receive that information promptly and completely and transparently as they should have reasonably expected to? Sometimes the administration gave explanations. Sometimes those explanations seemed legitimate. Sometimes the evidence just remains incomplete. And sometimes critics have raised concerns that deserve continued scrutiny. The point isn't that every one of these stories proves intentional concealment. The point is that taken together, they paint a picture worth examining. Transparency can't be measured by one report or one delayed publication or one missing webpage. It's measured by the direction of travel. Are we moving towards a government that gives citizens more reliable information or one that gives them less? Now, so far we've been talking about information the government chooses to publish, but transparency is tested another way too. Sometimes the government doesn't volunteer the information. Sometimes someone has to ask. And in our system of government, that's one of Congress's most important jobs. Congress doesn't ask questions because senators and representatives are personally curious. They're asking on behalf of us, the constituencies, which raises another question. What happens when the people asking for answers don't get them? So we've been talking so far about information that the government chooses to release, reports and data sets and warning letters and casualty figures and environmental records. In other words, information the government controls before anyone ever asks for it. But transparency has another test. Sometimes government doesn't volunteer the information. Sometimes someone has to ask. And of course, I'm talking about Congress. Now, I know for a lot of people, congressional hearings feel like a political reality television. And I'm one of those people. Members give speeches instead of asking questions. Witnesses filibuster instead of answering them. Cable news chops everything into 30-second clips. Everybody declares victory. Everybody goes home. Much of it is theater. But underneath all the cameras and the political grandstanding is something that should be considered genuinely important. Congressional oversight is one of the primary ways the American people find out what their government is doing. Members of Congress aren't simply asking questions out of curiosity, at least that's not supposed to be the point. They're asking on behalf of the public. I mean, think about it. There are nearly 340 million Americans. None of us can personally summon the Secretary of Defense into our living room. We can't subpoena the Attorney General or require the Director of National Intelligence to answer questions under oath. But Congress can. That's one of its constitutional jobs, oversight. It's one of the checks built into our system of government. The executive branch exercises enormous power. Congress exists in part to ask, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Is it legal? Can you prove it? What evidence do you have? And those questions are not hostile on their face. They're democratic questions. They're exactly the kinds of questions we should want our elected representatives asking. But oversight only works if witnesses actually answer. Not if they simply respond. There's a difference. Because responding to a question isn't the same as answering a question. If I ask you, did you eat the last piece of cheesecake? And you say, cheesecake is one of America's favorite desserts. You responded to the question. You didn't answer the question. If I ask, did you spend the money? And you reply, I've always been committed to fiscal responsibility. You're speaking, but you haven't answered. It sounds almost silly when you put it into everyday examples like that, but we tolerate exactly that kind of exchange in Washington all the time. And after a while, I think a lot of people just stop noticing it. We begin treating non-answers as though they're just another kind of answer. And let me assure you, they are not. So rather than give you a laundry list of officials who had difficult hearings, I want to look at a few specific exchanges, not because these are the only examples, but because they illustrate different ways transparency can break down. Now, before we do that, though, there's one case that sits almost perfectly at the intersection of everything we've talked about so far today. It isn't just about congressional oversight. It isn't just about releasing information. It's about a promise, a law, a public expectation, an ongoing debate over whether that promise, transparency, is fully being kept. And of course, I'm talking about the Epstein files. Now, before anyone, rolls their eyes or starts composing an angry email, this is not an episode about Jeffrey Epstein. It's an episode about transparency. The Epstein files matter here because transparency wasn't something critics demanded after the fact. It was something Donald Trump himself promised while running for office. During that campaign, Trump repeatedly indicated that he favored releasing the Epstein files. The implication was clear. Americans deserve to know what the government had. That promise continued after the inauguration. Attorney General Pam Bondi described the initial release of the Epstein-related material as part of the administration's commitment to transparency. Hoorah. Then Congress entered the picture. Lawmakers ultimately passed legislation requiring the Justice Department to release Epstein-related records subject to protections for victims, ongoing legal obligations, and other limited exceptions. The administration later announced that millions of pages had been released and maintained that it had complied with the law. Now, that's important because if we're going to be intellectually honest, we can't say nothing was released. Something was released. In fact, a lot of pages were released, but that's also where the controversy begins rather than ends, I think. Journalists, victims, advocates, members of Congress from both parties, and eventually a federal judge all continued asking variations of the same question. Was that everything? Or was it only everything the Justice Department chose to interpret as falling within its obligation? And those are not the same question. The administration says it complied with the law. Critics argue that important material remains withheld or insufficiently explained. And the dispute goes on. Now, notice what I'm not doing. I'm not telling you which side is right. I'm pointing out that one of the administration's signature transparency promises remains disputed. And when transparency itself becomes the subject of litigation, that's a story about transparency, not just Epstein and the files. Because ultimately, this isn't about one notorious criminal. It's about whether government fulfilled its own promise to let the public see. Now, let's move from promises and documents to promises made under oath. And we'll start with something that should be the easiest kind of question to answer. A yes or a no. Those are the questions that reveal the most. Not because they're complicated, but because they're simple. And when a witness repeatedly avoids a simple question, you have to notice the difference between giving testimony and giving information. So take Attorney General Pam Bondi, former Attorney General Pam Bondi. During one of her appearances before Congress, lawmakers pressed her about decisions made by the Department of Justice and about the administration's handling of politically sensitive investigations. And again, members asked variations of the same question. They weren't saying, tell us everything. They weren't saying, reveal confidential evidence, but simply, who made this decision? Or did you authorize this action? Or what role did you personally play? Those are oversight questions. They are designed to establish responsibility. Because if nobody made the decision, then nobody can be accountable for it. And if everybody made the decision, then once again, nobody can be held accountable for it. So instead of directly answering those questions, Bondi pivoted. She spoke about department priorities. She defended the administration's broader policies. She criticized previous administrations. She emphasized her commitment to enforcing the law. At one point, she talked about how strong the stock market was. Now, some of those statements may have been perfectly accurate, but they weren't answers to the question being asked. Now, to be fair, cabinet officials often have legitimate reasons not to discuss ongoing investigations. Sometimes revealing internal deliberations can legitimately compromise legal proceedings. Sometimes attorney-client privilege or other legal constraints genuinely limit what can be said publicly. Those explanations exist, but here's what transparency requires. If you cannot answer, you say why you cannot answer. You don't pretend you've answered when you haven't. there's a meaningful difference between saying, I can't answer because the matter is under active investigation, or simply talking until a particular congressperson's clock runs out. One is an explanation and the other is an escape. That distinction matters. Transparency isn't just about releasing information. It's also about honestly explaining why information can't be released, if that's the case. Another example, Pete Hegseth. His confirmation hearing was one of the most contentious of the administration. Supporters saw him as someone willing to challenge what they viewed as a stagnant military bureaucracy. Critics questioned his experience and his judgment and his past statements. Now, whether you supported his nomination or opposed it isn't really the issue. The transparency question is different. During his testimony, senators repeatedly asked him about specific past conduct, management decisions, public statements. In several exchanges, rather than directly addressing the underlying question, Hegseth pivoted to broader themes: restoring the warrior ethos, improving military readiness, ending what he described as political distractions inside the armed forces. Those are campaign themes. They were policy themes. But when the question is, did this specific event happen, or what exactly did you mean when you made this particular statement, a discussion of larger goals isn't responsive. Again, this isn't unique to Pete Hegseth. Politicians from both parties have been answering difficult questions this way for decades. What's different here is the standard being applied. This administration didn't simply promise to govern, they promised unprecedented transparency. And that's the measuring stick that I'm using here, and I don't think that's unfair. Not whether previous administrations did something similar or whether Democrats have ever dodged questions. The question is, did the administration meet its own standard? And Pete Hegseth has appeared in front of Congress since his confirmation hearings. And if you look at the videos of those, there were many examples of the same kind of thing in those. The situation did not improve once he was confirmed. So let's talk about Kash Patel, because his hearings prove some of the clearest examples of another transparency problem, not refusing to answer, but answering a different question. There were moments when senators asked Patel directly about prior public statements, contacts, or specific actions. And rather than staying inside the boundaries of the question, he often broadened the discussion. He spoke about reforming the FBI, restoring public confidence, ending political weaponization. And, those may have been sincere priorities, but listeners noticed something. I mean, if someone says, did you have this conversation? The answer isn't the FBI needs reform. If someone says, did this meeting occur? The answer isn't the American people deserve accountability. Those statements may very well be true. They're just unrelated. Think back to the bank analogy. You asked the mysterious $1,000 charge question. The representative gives you a passionate explanation of the company's commitment to customer service. Maybe it's an excellent speech. You're still waiting to hear about the $1,000. That's the difference between communication and information. That's why oversight matters. Congress isn't grading witnesses on how confidently they speak. It's trying to obtain facts, because facts are what allow oversight to function. And oversight is what allows democracy to function. It's not complicated, especially for an administration who has been repeating the word transparency as often as this one has. All right, now let's look at a different kind of exchange, one where the answer wasn't necessarily evasive, but where the explanation itself raised more questions. And that's Tulsi Gabbard. As director of national intelligence, she occupies a position or occupied a position where some information genuinely can't be discussed publicly. And that's not controversial. If senators ask about intelligence sources or classified collection methods or active operations, saying I can't answer that in open session is exactly the right response in some of those cases. Transparency has its limits. National security is one of them. But that's also why it's important to distinguish between classified information and policy questions. During several of her appearances before Congress, lawmakers asked Gabbard questions that had nothing to do with revealing intelligence sources. They were about decisions, processes, and assessments. Who knew what and when they knew it? There were times when she declined to answer in open session, citing classification concerns. And she did so in response to questions where it was not appropriate. Other times, members questioned whether the subject truly required that level of secrecy or whether a more complete public answer could have been given. Now, unless we're sitting in the classified briefing ourselves, we can't always know every detail, and that's okay. Remember the standard we've set for this episode. We're not pretending certainty where certainty doesn't exist. But transparency asks another question. When information genuinely cannot be discussed publicly, does the official clearly explain why? Or is just saying classified used as the end of the conversation? Those are different things. The first builds trust and the second one erodes it. People can accept that some information must remain secret. What they struggle with is not knowing whether secrecy is necessary or just convenient. And that brings us to RFK Jr. And again, I don't want to get into whether or not you support his policies. That could be a whole series of episodes on its own. What I'm talking about here is how he handled oversight. During his appearances before congressional committees, lawmakers repeatedly pressed him on scientific evidence, vaccine policy, staffing reductions, changes to public health programs. Sometimes the questions were straightforward. What evidence supports this decision? Can you point to the studies? What data are you relying on? And Kennedy's responses went to this broader theme gambit: restoring public trust, making government more transparent, eliminating conflicts of interest, reforming public health. I mean, those are important conversations. You have to laugh at the idea that he mentions making government more transparent while dodging a question. Is I mean, that's how I like my irony. And anyway, these things he talks about are important conversations, but they don't always answer the question being asked. If a senator asks, what evidence supports this specific policy? A discussion about restoring trust is not an answer. It's not providing evidence. And if the evidence exists, transparency suggests you should show it. You should want to show it. Not simply just say, trust me, it's there. This is actually one of the recurring patterns that in this administration. Officials often speak at length. They're rarely at a loss for words. The issue is never really silence. The issue is whether they're actually saying anything, whether the information people are seeking ever actually is included in the speech. It's an important distinction. Transparency isn't measured by the minutes spoken or the word count. It's measured by what questions actually get answered. Now, I want to pause here and make an observation. You may have noticed that I haven't accused anyone of lying. That's intentional, because lie is a serious word. It requires evidence that someone knowingly made false statements. Sometimes we have that evidence, sometimes we don't, but something can fall short of transparency without being a lie. A witness can answer a different question. A witness can provide only part of an answer. A witness can run out the clock. A witness can invoke confidentiality with no explanation. A witness can promise information later and then never provide it. None of those necessarily require proving intent, yet every one of them makes oversight less effective. And that's the larger point. Congressional oversight isn't supposed to be a game where witnesses earn points for surviving the difficult questions. It's supposed to be a mechanism through which the American people obtain that information about things their government is doing. If the answers become less informative, oversight is a joke. And if oversight is a joke, so is accountability. Now, before we circle around here, I do want to mention one more thing. There was a couple things about certain congressional hearings that didn't fit quite neatly into these topics, but I think still point towards the whole transparency issue. One of them was that folks like Kash Patel came with prepared statements written in notes, not about the subjects that were going to be asked, but about the people who were going to ask them. Responses to give to Senator X or Representative Y about them that could be used as deflections in answers. And I would say, for my sensibilities, that when you come to a hearing with those kinds of things ready at your disposal in your notes, your goal going in wasn't transparency. And the second thing is that in regards to the perjury topic, and as I just said, I'm not going to say this person committed perjury, that person lied under oath, but others have said that. There have been accusations of some of the answers in some of these hearings that we've been talking about, where it has been asserted by various people that the answers were objectively false. And I would also like to point out, especially since we're just coming off the week where Dr. Anthony Fauci is being criticized for using his Fifth Amendment right, that none of these people, none of the administration officials or nominees who dodged or refused to answer questions or may not have said things that were false, none of them have been part of a discussion about being held in contempt of Congress or worse. But Dr. Fauci is now going to live through a vote about whether his use of the Fifth Amendment was contempt of Congress. And whether or not it was is a subject people can debate. But the thing I wanted to point out was the hypocrisy. The hypocrisy of calling him before a contempt of Congress vote when none of the others who have done things to dodge questions or not answer questions or whatever, none of them have even been mentioned in a discussion of contempt of Congress. All right. So anyway, but getting back to what I want to go back to something we said at the beginning of the episode. Transparency isn't one thing. It's not a press conference or a slogan or a campaign promise. It has to be a system in which agencies publish information, officials answer legitimate questions, Congress performs oversight, journalists investigate, inspectors general audit, courts review disputes, and citizens compare what government says with what government actually demonstrates. When enough pieces of that system begin to weaken, the effect is bigger than any of the individual pieces. So let's step back now, because we spent, the last hour or so here examining individual examples. It's time to ask what they have in common. We've covered a lot of ground: the Pentagon, the FDA, CDC, the EPA, congressional hearings, Epstein files. And again, at first glance, they don't seem to have much in common. One involves military reporting, another food safety, another public health, another environmental data, another cabinet officials testifying before Congress, another centers on the release of decades-old investigative files. Completely different subjects, But I don't think this episode has really been about any of them. That wasn't my goal. I think it's been about something bigger. It's about how transparency actually works, or perhaps more accurately, how it's not working. Transparency isn't about one action. It isn't about a report or a database or a hearing or a system. I mean, think about your car. If one headlight burns out, you can still drive. If one windshield wiper stops working, you'll probably make it home. If your speedometer quits, it's a problem, but the car still goes. If your brakes start failing, now we're having a very different conversation. No single failure necessarily makes the entire vehicle unusable, but as more systems begin to fail, your confidence in the car vanishes, and rightly so. Government accountability is supposed to work the same way. Transparency isn't dependent on one institution. It depends on all the institutions. Federal agencies collecting accurate information, scientists publishing their findings, inspectors general, the ones that haven't been fired, conducting independent audits, journalists asking uncomfortable questions, Congress exercising oversight, courts reviewing disputes, the Freedom of Information Act allowing citizens to request government records, civil servants maintaining archives and databases, whistleblowers protected when they're exposing wrongdoing. Each thing performs a different job. Each checks a different box, and each one strengthens the others. If one part struggles, if the rest of the system can often compensate. If an agency delays information, journalists may uncover it. If Congress can't obtain answers, inspectors general may investigate it. There's a lot of cross-pollination there, but that's why the founders didn't design a government built entirely on trust. They designed one with built-in verification. They assumed people would sometimes abuse power, and they assumed ambitious people would occasionally put politics ahead of principle. They assumed officials would sometimes prefer secrecy over embarrassment. They didn't simply hope leaders would be virtuous. They created systems that made verification possible. And that's an important distinction. Democracy doesn't require us to believe government. It requires government to give us enough information to decide whether it deserves to be believed. And that's where I think we've really gotten ourselves into trouble. Somewhere along the way, transparency became confused with communication. We started measuring openness by microphones. How many interviews, how many press conferences, how many social media posts, how many hours of television. But that's not transparency. Speaking constantly isn't transparency. It can flood the internet with videos and press conferences and interviews and tweets and so on. It can answer 50 questions while carefully avoiding the 5 questions that mattered the most. Think back to the examples that we've discussed. The Pentagon, the FDA, the CDC, the EPA. Cabinet officials continued appearing before Congress. The Justice Department continued holding press conferences. None of these places disappeared. Nobody barricaded the doors. But, that's why this isn't a caricature. This episode isn't a caricature that you might have expected. It's not about silence. It's about substance. Were Americans consistently receiving the information they reasonably needed to evaluate what their government was doing? Sometimes the answer appears to be yes. Sometimes the answer is less clear. Sometimes explanations were offered. Sometimes those explanations may or may not be entirely legitimate. Sometimes the explanations themselves became the subject of continuing scrutiny. I've tried very hard today to not overstate any individual example, because if one example turns out to have an innocent explanation, then the larger question still remains. What's the overall direction? Are we building a government that makes verification easier or harder? Because that's ultimately the test, not perfection, direction. A transparent administration, certainly the most transparent administration in history, should leave the public with more confidence that it can independently verify the claims. Not simply more confidence because officials never stop talking to us. That's an important distinction. Trust isn't built by repetition, it's built by verification. And once you start looking at transparency through that lens, I think something interesting happens. You stop asking, do I believe this politician? And instead you begin asking, can I check what they're telling me? That may be one of the healthiest habits a citizen can develop. Certainly one that I think is underdeveloped these days. Politicians change, administrations come and go, parties rise and fall, but that question should remain through all of it. Can I check what they're telling me? Can the public verify what government is saying? And if the answer is yes, then transparency is probably healthy. If the answer increasingly becomes, I don't know, then that's not transparency. We've got a problem. Self-government only works when the people being governed can actually see enough of what their government is doing to make informed choices. And that brings us back to where we started, the promise. The ones you heard in the clips at the beginning. You heard Caroline Leavitt, you heard RFK Jr., you heard Tulsi Gabbard, you heard Donald Trump. And I'm pretty sure that when I say that this was a small segment of the available clips of people talking about transparency. But these are all different people in different jobs speaking to different audiences, and they all return to the same idea, transparency. Not competence, not effectiveness, transparency. And that's important. Words matter. When an administration repeatedly uses the same word to describe itself, it's inviting us, the public, to evaluate it by that standard. Imagine a restaurant that advertises itself as having the fastest service in town. Nobody else made that claim. This restaurant did. If customers later complain about waiting an hour for their meals, the issue isn't whether the other restaurants are too slow or they're also slow. The issue is whether this restaurant lived up to the promise that it made. That's where we are. The administration asked to be judged by transparency. So, how did it do? I've given you a bunch of examples. Does every one of these examples prove deliberate concealment? No. Does every delay prove bad faith? No. Does every incomplete answer amount to a lie? No. That isn't what the evidence supports, but it also isn't the question that we've been asking. The question has always been, taken together, does this record resemble the most transparent administration in American history? For me, the answer is no. That's ridiculous. This is not a remarkably transparent administration, let alone the most transparent administration in history. Not because every individual controversy points in exactly the same direction, but because the overall direction does. And again, we encountered situations where information became harder to obtain, harder to verify, slower to emerge than we should reasonably be expected to deal with after hearing such sweeping promises of openness. And here's something I think is worth remembering. You don't have to believe every critic. You don't have to distrust every administration official. You don't even have to agree with my conclusions. But if an administration repeatedly promises unprecedented transparency, it's fair to ask whether the public now has more tools to independently verify what the government's doing, or fewer. I don't think that's a partisan question. I think it's a legitimate one, a democratic one. Transparency isn't measured by applause at campaign rallies. It isn't measured by social media engagement or the number of interviews a press secretary gives. It's measured by whether ordinary citizens can actually find the information they need to hold their government accountable. And ultimately, that's a standard every administration should be willing to meet. One of the things that I personally love most about democracy is that it assumes we don't have to trust people simply because they hold office. And I mean, think about that for a second. The founders could have designed a system that relied on good intentions, but they didn't. Instead, they assumed something remarkably practical. People were people. Power is tempting. Mistakes happen. Ambition exists. And sometimes governments would rather tell a flattering story than an uncomfortable truth. So they built a system around verification instead of blind trust. That's why we have oversight. That's why we have inspectors general and courts and journalists and public records laws. That's why agencies collect public and publish data. Not because government should never make mistakes, but because citizens should have a way to discover them. That is transparency. It's not perfection, verification. So today wasn't about proving that every action in this administration is wrong, nor was it about claiming that previous administrations always get this right. It was about measuring one administration against one promise, a promise it made repeatedly. And I think that that's a habit worth keeping. The next time you hear a politician from either party promise transparency, don't applaud, don't roll your eyes either. Just ask a few simple questions. Can I verify what they're telling me? Are they releasing the underlying information? Are they answering difficult questions? When they can't answer, are they explaining why they can't answer? And when the facts become politically inconvenient, does transparency survive? Because that's where the slogan ends and accountability actually begins. Remember what we said at the beginning of the episode. Transparency isn't what a government calls itself. It's what the public is allowed to verify. A government doesn't earn trust by asking us to believe that it's transparent. It earns trust by giving us the means to find out whether what it's saying is true. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for downloading and listening to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. It was a long one today. I had a neighbor outside the house here who isn't letting the high gas prices prevent him from doing a muffler recital. So I had to keep starting and stopping. But I hope you enjoyed what you heard. I hope it made you think. I hope it raised some legitimate questions in your mind. And I would love to hear those questions. I gave you information at the beginning of the episode about how you can contact the podcast, and I hope that you do. I'll be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.